right, we are live. Welcome, everyone. It's going to take a second for people to join. So we'll be starting
We're
the
live.
debate in about 5 minutes. So in the meantime, we're going to share it around, make sure everyone has time to join, put it up there on Facebook. So we are actually right on time. I am impressed. Okay.
All right. Is it on your?
Yes, it's on
Oh,
my
it is.
it's
I'm
on
now
my
looking at
page.
myself.
Yeah, you can probably see the time delay a second. There we go. Okay.
All right, I got it shared into my group.
Perfect.
Jake probably just had to minimize while he
Yeah. Can you hear me still?
shares.
Yes.
Yeah, I
Yes.
had to minimize while sharing. I'm tagging a couple people. All right. It's tagged a
All
couple people.
right. I'm going to share it to the Lucid
All right.
Truth.
Here I am. Can we? How will we see when people are viewing?
There's a little number, and people will comment in the meantime.
There's the public chat, right?
Yes. Yes,
For
and
some
people
reason
will
I
all
can't
see
chat
that.
in that, but I can chat in the host chat, but not the public chat.
Oh, yeah. That's for people who can comment on the actual stream.
Mm-hmm.
So they will be. You could technically go to Facebook and comment there, but yeah. All right. So we've got it all shared, all the technical stuff figured out. We've got people listening in. So are you guys ready to begin?
Yes.
All right, let's give it a start. So, Kyle, let's start with you. Do you want to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your philosophy?
Yeah, I do. My name's Kyle Wagner. I've been involved in the libertarian movement since 2012. Um, I was always sort of I wanted smaller government, never knew exactly how to get there. I didn't quite understand what was wrong with Bush and the Republicans. They never seemed to cut spending or government. And then Ron Paul came along. I was just like, wow, I agree with this guy on everything. He's awesome. I just became hooked. I started really going down the rabbit hole into, his background, his influences, Murray Rothbard, the Mises Institute, Gary North, and ultimately Mises. And so, I became radicalized, I would say. I'm pretty extreme on the spectrum as far as liberty goes, but I've come to through reading Mises came to see that there are holes in the anarchist theory, and so I came to oppose anarchy. I was originally in a group called ANCAP versus ANCOM debate group, where ANCAPs and ANCOMs were debating, and then I stayed in that group, but I broke out. Once I became a minarchist, I decided to form my own group called Anarcho-Capitalism versus Minarchism debate group, where for the past 4 years, we've, for the most part, focused on the debate between anarcho-capitalism and limited government or small government, which is probably, in my opinion, the single largest schism in the libertarian movement. It creates a lot of problems. It creates a lot of headbutting between anti-government people and small government people. And a good example would be like Arvin Vora attacking the U.S. military, and the political end of the party being offended or opposed to that kind of thing. So I think it creates a lot of problems because we have a completely different message and a completely different viewpoint, and people think that, oh, small government and no government are close, and I've always made the point that they are not close. They're very, very different philosophies and very, very different worldviews, and we are teaching people different things. We're explaining things differently, and so I think it's important to resolve the argument, and I'll be taking the position that we do need a government.
Okay, thank you for that, Kyle. Jake, go ahead and introduce yourself and your philosophy.
So I'm Jake McCauley, and I have been involved in libertarianism since I was about 14. I thought I came up with it actually. went to my dad and said, hey, I got a new idea for a political party called the Essentialist Party, right? And government will only do like the most essential things, basically minarchism. Because I was sick of the Republicans and the Democrats. I came from a Republican upbringing, both my folks. Was interested in politics pretty young. I was a minarchist, so starting when I was about 14, then till I was about 18. Minarchist for 4 years. And very much like Kyle, constantly arguing it. I brought a lot of people over to minarchism as a minarchist. And then when I was about 18, I started analyzing it from different perspectives, both moral and practical. I found things like the non-aggression principle. I too got into like Mises and Rothbard and Ron Paul as well. Very big into Rothbard. And I came to the conclusion that government cannot be morally legitimate, that it inherently violates the non-aggression principle, which I'm a proponent of. I believe Kyle is not. I'm correct. Yes, Kyle is not a proponent of the non-aggression principle. That's, in fact, an argument he uses against anarcho-capitalism. But I now have been an anarcho-capitalist for roughly 4 or 5 years now. I'm 23, I was 18, so whatever that is. I've spoken at some anarchist events like Anarcho-Polko and Anarchon. People sometimes pay me to make memes and debate and stuff, and I debate all the time. Anarchy, the hobby. I'm very much in my comfort zone here. And me and Kyle have personal history. We've been arguing with each other for how many years now?
Yeah, since the beginning, because Jake was in the group that ANCAP versus ANCOM that I mentioned. That's where I first encountered him.
Oh.
Yeah, that sounds about right. It's been a minute. And we have, he pipes into my posts and vice versa and stuff. This will just be a different format for a debate that me and him have been having for years.
Great. Well, I'm glad we can take it onto video.
I've been wanting to do this for forever. This is like Christmas for me.
This is going to be good. So real quick, before we start, I'd like to thank our sponsors at antrapdesigns.com. You can get the best anarchy shirts there with very comfortable clothing. So go ahead and check that out. There are a lot of options. Okay.
I should have worn mine. I have one, and it's great.
Yeah, that's great. That's very fitting. So, all right. I think we have a lot of topics to cover, and we'll try to keep them one at a time so we stay concise. And so, since all of the political unrest in the nation right now is centered around police brutality, I think it'd be good to start with police. So, Kyle, you started with your introduction. So, Jake, what do you think about police in terms of government and anarchy? Do you think that they're an essential component of society that should be mandated by government, or do you think that there's an alternative solution?
Well, clearly that I'm coming from the ANCAP perspective. And what if just to screw with you? Yeah, we need government police.
I wouldn't really know what
throw
to do.
You both off completely. Obviously, I think that we don't need government police. I think that police in the form they exist now is to act as the enforcers of a ruling class of the state, to enforce whatever arbitrary nonsense gets scribbled down by politicians. I think police as they exist now, while they do serve some necessary functions, such as protection from murderers and the like, they are definitely a net negative in their current form, in that 82% of arrests are for victimless crimes. That's according to the FBI. 86% of incarceration, also victimless. The police are currently, for the most part, completely parasitic and coercive, mostly against innocent people. Most of what they enforce is not just. I think that if we did away with government police entirely, where me and Kyle fundamentally differ, I think that the absence of government police would be met with a saturation of the demand for protection by other means. I think people want to be safe. People want themselves and their belongings and their loved ones and such to be protected, and their properties and their businesses. I think, as we can see plainly, when there is a huge demand, a supply follows, as long as it's something that can be made. So not teleportation or something, but things like food and guys with guns to protect you from bad guys, good guys with guns. Things like that, which are simple commodities and services that are viable, can be done by way of free enterprise. That I want to buy the service of policing. I think that can be done a great many ways through the private sector as functions of everything from direct protection of a property, such as a road or a housing development, to personal subscription or through my insurance company. There's 100 different ways you can get private protection without the necessity for taxation and a monopoly on force.
Okay,
And
that was a good introduction. Just so we're not getting too much to respond to, Kyle, what do you think about what Jake said, and what do you think about police in relation to government?
Yeah, I think police are not just in for protection. Okay, they're also for law enforcement. I mean, in fact, they're primarily a law enforcement agency, and so they're enforcing the rules that
entirely.
the legislators have decided upon, the people that have been elected to, make the rules for society. So from that standpoint, when you talk about a group of people living together and interacting with each other, they need a common set of rules. And I don't think ANCAPs typically dispute that fact. I mean, they talk about private law and they talk about the need for some universal rules. They just want to be the ones to make those rules, and which is not realistic. But I don't want to go off track there. I just want to continue talking about the police. Um, so I understand completely when people look at situations like the Floyd killing recently, where they say, "Well, these guys are just abusive." I mean, but that's one example of many, or there's many other examples where police actually were in the right, and where they actually arrested a bad guy and apprehended him and nothing without an incident. So, I don't want to focus on the examples where things went wrong and say, well, we need to abolish these guys, while ignoring all the instances where they actually apprehended a bad person. Jake mentions the victimless crimes. I mean, this society has decided that drugs are going to be outlawed. I know that's a constant source of irritation for libertarians, but um, that's the political reality that we live in. We live in a culture that does not accept heroin, methamphetamine, crack cocaine. They just do not tolerate it. And so that's where we end up with this conflict between the police and the people that are trying to use those things. And it's not the police's fault that those are quote unquote victimless crimes. I mean, they are hired to do a job, they're paid to do a job, and that job is to enforce the laws that the politicians and ultimately society agree upon, with the exception of anarcho-capitalists and some libertarians. But most people agree with those laws.
Okay, thank you for that, Kyle. So, Jake.
So, where we would fundamentally disagree there is the premise that society in the aggregate has authority over the individual, that if 5 people declare that nobody is allowed to wear hats anymore, that they can then force that onto the individual. I think that, like Lysander Spooner said, a man's rights are his own against one man or against millions calling themselves a government. And this is generally congruent with the libertarian philosophy overall, which, I mean, me and Kyle agree on like individual issues, like asked in a political test context. 99.9% of the time, me and Kyle would agree. But where, I want every individual to be able to have what they want for themselves in their own life, as long as they don't go impose on others. Now, there is a way that the conflict you mentioned, Kyle, can be avoided. The conflict you mentioned is specifically drugs. A lot of society does not want people to be at liberty to be using drugs around them and bringing, heroin around where their kids are going to be going or whatever. People want themselves and their families away from all that. But by the same token, there's a whole lot of people who want to be able to use drugs. Now, in a statist paradigm, where what is and isn't allowed is decided by the majority, and then that finding is imposed on everybody, where it's not polycentric, you necessarily have this conflict of interests, and you get huge casualties. I mean, how many people have been killed or incarcerated, what I think you would agree to be unjust, over this war on drugs? But there's a way around that. Suppose that you are a family man who has kids, and maybe you come from a Christian, fundamentalist Christian background, and you don't want drugs. I'm not saying this is applicable to you, but hypothetically, you don't want that stuff around you in your world around your kids, right? And there's some good reasons for that. Heroin and stuff, it does ruin lives. People OD, people get hooked. Generally not a good idea to be using it. You, in a statist society, must either be forcing your will on someone else, force them, to go to jail for drugs or whatever, or be killed if they won't, or they're forcing you to have to deal with it. But in a free market society, you would be at liberty to choose whether it's a housing development or an HOA or simply your own private property. You choose what rules you want applying to you in your area to some extent, meaning I can have an HOA, right? Say I'm a developer, I build 1,000 houses, and part of your agreement to move into one of those houses is you'll abide by the rules of the HOA I've created. One of those can be no drugs. So you can have a drug-free HOA over here, drug-friendly apartment complex across town or something. Everybody can, for the most part, get what they want. If what you want is to rape and murder people and stuff like that, nobody's going to tolerate that. The demand for protection of one's, you could say, life, liberty, and property, in the spirit of the founders and all that, the demand for protection of life, liberty, and property greatly overwhelms the demand to be able to micromanage people's personal lives. Only when you have a monopoly on force does this inherent conflict and mass imposition of people's subjective values onto people get to manifest. There doesn't have to be this conflict.
Okay. Real quick before we go to Kyle, I have a question for Jake. Jake, are these rights enforcement agencies?
Yeah. Rights enforcement agency is a term that I like. I like David Friedman. He loves that term. Every security company that currently exists could be called a rights enforcement agency. Every real security company. I'm not talking about government contractors hired to go do shady shit overseas. But I mean, Brinks, Garda, Ring, ADT, companies that provide security systems and guards to protect property, usually what they're for, protect property, or armored trucks for cash or whatever.
Okay, so
they're enforcing rights.
Police?
Say it again.
These would be kind of the substitute for a police in a free society?
Well, there can be lots of different versions. There can be some that are specifically like you've got a company that patrols a property like a shopping mall or a road, because roads are private in a free market society. So, each road has its own, every housing development, an HOA, as well as there can be versions that are not tied to a geographic location, such as your insurance company. I used to be in the insurance business. It could easily make sense for different insurance providers who cover people's like homes and cars and whatnot, or their physical bodies, to pull in if they're nearby to each other or whatever. They could pull in to provide security, or that could just be part of your insurance subscription. You could subscribe on your own. It could be a work benefit. I'm an employer, and I could easily see that being something held as standard, because people don't want to be without protection. That's it's kind of central to my argument, is that regardless of what happens, supply will chase demand. There's a million ways that can turn out. You can just subscribe yourself to a company. There would be, I imagine there would be 911 equivalents, right? That maybe they just dispatch you at whatever agency is closest to you.
Okay. So, all right, thank you for answering that question. Kyle, what do you think about rights enforcement agencies outside of government? Do you see any conflicts between ones that might dispute, maybe ways to resolve that? What's your take on what Jake said?
Yeah, of course, and we should try to keep these responses a little quicker, a little more back and forth.
Sorry, you're right.
I guess the question becomes, well, what rights are they enforcing, or what are they enforcing, and how do you reconcile the conflicts between what people think should be enforced? Whereas, some woman named Karen might think that Jake shouldn't be allowed to use heroin in her neighborhood. Jake thinks he should be allowed to use heroin, and now you have Jake's enforcement agency in conflict with Karen's enforcement agency. And so that's sort of a microcosm of what we live with, which is, humans live in groups. We live in, what are basically large, these conflicts between people with no reconciliation. Like it ends up having to be one way or the other. Jake wants to make it so we can have our cake and eat it too, and we can have the drug-free zone here and the drugs are allowed zone over there. But in practice, there are people all scattered throughout who live intermingled with each other, who have different opinions on whether drugs should or should not be allowed. and I don't understand how he thinks that everybody can get their way.
Okay, Jake.
I'd be happy to go in more in depth on that. So you've got, did you say a Karen that doesn't want people using
for it?
I did, yes.
In an anarcho-capitalist society, this is both a hope and a prediction, but I think a pretty solid prediction. Everything by default, when there's a question, it's probably legal. Basic liberty, like there's not a question of whether or not it's legal to eat a sandwich. There's no law saying you can or can't eat a ham sandwich, but by default, you can eat a ham sandwich. And the same thing would apply to things like using heroin. Now, as you bring up, there are Karens. There are people who want to ensure that, like, people aren't using heroin in their own neighborhood, which in some sense is totally reasonable. So, you've got a neighborhood. Now, Karen's rights enforcement agency, who she calls on to deal with the person who's peacefully using heroin, her rights enforcement agency goes to, say I'm the heroin user. I don't use heroin anymore, but say I am. Her agency comes to my rights enforcement agency. Now they have several options in front of them because her rights enforcement agency, say, wants to jail me. I don't think that would be it, but wants to jail me for using the heroin. And my rights enforcement agency wants to protect my liberty to use heroin. That's what I hire them for. Now, one option, the obvious one, they could fight it out. They could go to war and be warlords. Now, I run a business. If my business, granted, I'm not in the warfare industry, but if my business suddenly had to go to war with every other business of its kind, or had to potentially be ready for war at any moment with other businesses of the same kind, boy, we wouldn't stay in business very long at all. We'd, if we don't get killed in the process, our costs are going to be through the roof. War is very expensive. And then the hazard pay for my employees. If my employees were getting killed, I have employees that have not been killed. If any of them were to suddenly get killed, the amount of money I would have to pay the other ones, it would be completely infeasible. Businesses do not want the outlandish costs associated with war. A big part of why you see so much war in the world is because the costs are externalized to the taxpayer. But with that not being a factor, rights enforcement agencies are contingent, their ability to operate is contingent on the consent of those they're selling protection to. So
okay, I think that was pretty good. Kyle, do you think? It's okay.
I didn't go where I was going.
It's okay. We'll go back to you. We'll go back to that point. But what do you think, Kyle? Do you think that rights enforcement agencies could use a form of arbitration to settle their disputes, or do you think that would be too variable?
Yeah, well, I think it's unrealistically optimistic to think that certain people wouldn't be able to or wouldn't be willing to go to war to get their way, and that the cost would be more of a deterrent to some people than others. So if you had, 100 Karens and one Jake, they're going to pool their resources. They're going to be willing to overpower Jake's protection agency with their greater resources, and so you kind of run into this thing where it's like you're optimistically hoping that people are going to peacefully resolve their differences, in spite of the fact that historical evidence is that's not what happens. When people really want to get their way, they're fully willing to use any means necessary. And so I think that anarcho-capitalism would open the door to the most ruthless, the richest, the most powerful people to trample those who have less means, who can't afford a rights enforcement agency, who aren't organized. That's another very important point, is when you talk about conflicts, a lot of times it comes down to numbers. That's true in war, that's true in sports. I mean, if you can outnumber your opponent, you can get your way. And so again, if we have the one drug user trying to go about his business in a society that does not tolerate drugs, they are going to stomp him. He is not going to be able to afford to protect himself from them.
I should prelude
about that, Jake.
I should prelude that if we're living in a society where 99 or so, if everybody in the society is a raging, authoritarian, violent person who is personally themselves violent, then no matter what system you live in, it will be terrible. This is true of any kind of, I don't think you'd have much anarchy with that kind of system, or with that kind of paradigm, but there's no system where everybody being a violent maniac is mitigated effectively. Everybody can't be a violent maniac and have a society in general work. This is true of any system. Now, Kyle mentioned history. Historically, rewind a little bit, I think the burden of proof is misplaced a little bit here. traditionally, the burden of proof falls on those who are advocating for a serious change in something that I have to, because I'm trying to change society, I have to prove that it would be better. I don't agree with this, though. I think that governments in the last 100 years alone have killed over 250 million of their own citizens, not including active war, just democide. They've killed hundreds of millions. Government is by far the most violent and destructive institution in human history. I don't even think, Kyle, you would try to refute this. The vast majority of bloodshed and warfare and havoc and destruction and children left without parents or limbs, all of the most horrific things we can imagine, families being boiled by firebombs. This has all happened with government in place. And this has generally happened with governments that were founded on principles of being the most limited possible. Like the United States government has been one of the most destructive and one of the most well thought out originally, like to be a limited state, to be a minarchist state. And historically, it became this giant Leviathan that kills civilians by the millions. So we do have some historical precedent. Now, granted, some of it is fairly shaky because there's conflicting records and history debates are often become a whose source do you trust more kind of thing. But there is reason to believe that there is historical precedent for anarcho-capitalist legal systems. You've got things like the Brehon system in Ireland. Me and Kyle have talked about that a little before. In Ireland, prior to conquest by Oliver Cromwell, for between 1,000 and 9,000 years, you had a legal system called the Brehon system, which was a function of the market, as in people would voluntarily enter mutual protection contracts, security contracts with each other called sureties. And when there was a conflict, as in Bob thought that John robbed him or something and wanted to go collect restitution, they would take it to a private judge called a brehon, an arbitrator. And in that time, it was generally like respected elders were socially seen as worthy of being brehons. But anyone could, in theory, be one. Now, there were kings. These kings had no legal authority whatsoever, though. They were more like religious leaders. They had private associations called tuatha, which had kind of an insurance-like thing. They were religious organizations, and they controlled the society's militant ability. Participation, it wasn't a state, though. Participation in a tuath, in theory, was voluntary.
Okay, so you have some historical examples here. So eventually I want Jake to answer Kyle's point about the money to pay for a rights enforcement agency.
Sorry. Kyle said a lot of things that I didn't respond to.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm curious about that. But first, I want Kyle to answer. Kyle, Jake brought up the violence of government in terms of war and the violence towards their own citizens. Do you think that violence is worth the order? And if so, how?
It not always. I mean, it really depends on the situation. It depends on the government. You know, when we talk about these atrocities, one thing that's happened in the past is, you know, there certainly have been aggressive governments, violent governments. And so you end up having other governments, other organizations having to rise up to confront them. I mean, that's what war ultimately is a conflict between governments. And a government or a military, that is as humans, our maximum capacity for force. That's the greatest organization of people, the most people. As a nation, when you try to raise a military to fight a war, that is going to the extremes and trying to raise your strongest possible fighting force. And so some of those conflicts that he will throw in there is, oh, this is just governments. Well, it may have been an aggressive government and a defensive government actually having, a defender government actually having a conflict over a piece of territory or over people. And I do want to point out, like, governments they are organizations of individuals, of numerous individuals. They're organizations of people. There's really no way to say, like, as an anarchist, that people can't organize themselves in such a fashion as a government. There's no way to stop them from doing that. You're never going to convince everyone not to organize like that. So, faced with adversity, faced with a real problem, you can bet that people are going to organize into a larger fighting force, and try to win.
I would absolutely agree that in the face of adversity, people, if needed, will organize into a greater fighting force. And the most powerful fighting forces as cohesive units are government militaries. But historically, now I'm not even saying no military, by the way. I'll get there. Historically, guerrillas tend to have the tactical advantage. Societies fighting back against invading militaries, even in a decentralized fashion, such as the Viet Cong or the colonists. Now, they did raise the whole Continental Army and such. But societies rebelling tend to have advantage over who they're fighting. Like even Ireland, which was invaded by a much greater empire, the Cromwellian British Empire. They lasted in that conflict for around 100 years before Ireland had been fully subdued. I think if they had been governed and there'd been a head to sever, one monopoly on force able to surrender on behalf of everybody, Cromwell would have won in a matter of weeks. Now, I agree that with Kyle that people will organize ultimately as needed for things like defense. Where we disagree is I don't think that has to be socialized. I don't think this has to be a function of socialism. I think the fact that I want to be safe and you want to be safe means that there's a market for the provision of safety. Now, any individual security provider is not going to be able, chances are anyway, is not going to be able to repel the armies of the world. However, you're Karen, I'm me. You want to, you want to prosecute me for heroin, and I want to not be prosecuted for heroin. Now, these two take the matter to, just in theory, right? They take it to a private arbitrator and say your rights Karen, your rights enforcement agency, won't abide by the verdict, right? They won't go along with it. Now, the law of constant dealings applies. Nobody else will be in contracts with them. Nobody else will use arbitration with them. They're on their own now. My company, on the other hand, has not violated contract, has not demonstrated itself to be untrustworthy by the rest of the security market, so backup contracts can still be effective. If I'm a security company and you're a security company, I want to make sure that I can't just be destroyed by competitors or by gangsters or foreign governments or whatever. I want some protection for myself, even though that's what I'm providing. So I enter a backup contract with your security company, your rights enforcement agency. Now, it can't be unconditional. I'm not going to agree that whatever conflict you get in, I'll jump in and start fighting for you. If you go try to rape and pillage and stuff, I'm not going to help you because in that case, I'm endangering myself and my customers and the money of my customers unnecessarily. But with a conditional backup contract, which I can reasonably say, I think, that would be a standard. Rights enforcement agencies don't want to be on their own. They want backup. They want protection. I think through a contract network, you wind up with a web of cohesion between security providers that can overwhelm any such Karen agency that demonstrates itself to be a rogue criminal agency.
Okay, and Jake, these agencies would presumably pay for the people who can't afford the services at the bottom?
There are several ways that can be done. First of all, I don't think you really would have poverty in a complete free market society. I could spend an hour just talking about how the state keeps people poor. But like even all that aside, even assuming that there's still poverty as we know it, of course there will still be inequality. Somebody who is poor, who can't afford to subscribe themselves to a security provider, which would be competitively priced, unlike the government police. Somebody who doesn't have money to do that has several options. Number one, if they need immediate protection, they can physically be somewhere that's open to the public that has security, such as a shopping mall or most roads or whatever. If it's things like justice, which goes along with policing, you can use things like claim subrogation. That's another point David Friedman brings up, is there's a historical precedent for that in like England, under English common law. You found people subrogating claims, meaning you rob me, but I'm too poor to sue you myself. So I sell my claim to restitution to a company that does that professionally. So they give me some money for restitution, and then they take the whole thing from you. So it's still profitable. Even people with nothing, if you have a potential claim, then you have a way to get it served.
Okay, so Kyle, what do you think about this contract network of arbitrators? And how do you
contract network of security providers? I mean, arbitrators would enter contracts with each other and such too. But as far as the wielding of force, this is the point of arguing with Kyle, where one thing leads to another, and the argument is not happening anymore. Wielding of force.
Right.
Yeah.
How does
Okay.
this relate to a military, Kyle? And how do you think it's maybe a good idea that could work, or do you think it's maybe been tried before? What's your take on this?
I mean, I would ask the anarchist who do they think is going to decide what all these private what is the word I'm looking for? It's not mercenaries. Who is going to decide what these mercenaries can and can't do?
They are
Uh,
mercenaries. Yeah.
well, that's what they are because they're
Yes.
they're they're muscle for hire, right? Muscle
Yes.
for hire to the highest bidder. Ultimately, it's totally
Sellswords.
unrealistic to think that they're going to be noble or something like that, or even even form a network of contracts. I mean, what you're going to have is you're going to have a perpetual conflict between private interests. You know, this company fighting with that company, and this faction fighting with that faction. You know, that people just do not collaborate the way that you think that they do in a large group setting. There's too much disagreement. So I just think that's really unrealistic. And, you know, earlier he mentioned like, you know, two people that have a dispute going to private arbitration. You know, that is just such a rosy worldview that's how they would just hold hands and go off to private arbitration to settle their differences. You know, if you have a neighborhood again of Karens and one drug user, you know, they're going to gang up on him. They're not going to just go peacefully to private arbitration. They're going to impose their will on him. And I just think he should be more realistic about how people are and how power actually works when the larger group has more power.
Okay, so Jake,
So
go ahead and respond to that, and then we'll go on to Kyle. You can respond after he says anything, but then we'll go on to laws because laws are what's actually enforced by the police that we were talking about earlier. So go ahead, Jake.
So a few points. Number one, you mentioned that private rights enforcers, which I would agree can be called mercenaries. It's fine. I don't think of that as a very dirty word. It's a neutral word, like a gun. You know, they can be used for good or evil. I would say that government is a gun for the highest bidder, but it's a monopoly gun for the highest bidder. It's the giant gun that no one can overwhelm without the process of a revolution. It's a giant gun capable of imposing whatever it wants, pretty much, onto everybody, as long as it's mild enough that people don't revolt. I mean, we can observe plainly that politicians and bureaucrats, they rule in favor of the highest bidding corporations, you know, cronyist corporate cartels, you know, the big pharmas and all that, bankers, special interests of all kinds. I mean, politicians are constantly caught. Imagine how much they're not caught. They're constantly caught doing this. And by the way, this process alone is kind of evidence that even under the worst of conditions, people will, even under the most scrutinized and attacked of positions, people will still enter contracts with each other out of mutual benefit. Now, as far as you mentioned a neighborhood of 100 Karens and one drug user. So this is where property rights, like I was talking about with HOAs and stuff, become relevant, because those Karens, if they want to be able to regulate the personal consumption of people around them, they can simply go to a drug-free HOA or something like that. Now, as far as you say that people can't organize enough to like use arbitration and enter contract networks, but what world are we living in? We already live in a world where we're completely surrounded by enormously complex industry-wide contract networks, and private arbitration is constantly used. I used to be in the insurance industry, and insurance companies only use private arbitration, except when they're legally required to use government courts, because government courts they found to be so inefficient and cost inefficient, they don't want to screw with them at all. They like private arbitration better. You've got enormous organizations like the American Arbitration Association. And this is true in most major industries. I mean, I've been in like the food industry too. And I don't know what industry you're in, Kyle, but there's a good chance that whatever it is does involve like ultimately millions of people cooperating by contract out of mutual self-interest. The only thing I assume of human nature, I mean, I assume a lot, you know, I'm a praxeologist like you, but what I assume of human nature as far as people's attitude is that people will do what serves them. That I don't assume people to be good and righteous. I don't assume people to be moral. Any system works better if people are good. But if I don't trust people with the freedom to run their own lives, then I can't trust them with the power to run mine or the power to run millions of others. I'm much more hesitant to trust people, bearing in mind that there are evil and sadistic and extraordinarily selfish and cruel and wicked people out there. So the existence of those people, I think it is an argument for government to protect from them, but I think it's a stronger argument against government because those people tend to be who controls it.
Okay, so that was good. Kyle, feel free to make a quick rebuttal, and then I want to point out something Jake said, which will bring the conversation to an interesting point. So feel free.
Sure, there was a lot to unpack there, but he mentioned that people do use private arbitration today. I would say that they use that because um, actually going to war with each other is off the table. It's illegal. We have prohibitions on shooting your enemy. They try to settle it civilly. When you have a real conflict, when people are really at each other's throats, they don't tend to go to private arbitration. It usually ends up in courts, which have authority, power, and coercive power behind them to force one party to do something that they don't want to do. I think that goes off the table in an anarchist system. Although I guess that's up for dispute whether a private court has enforcement capacity or not, and what those mechanisms of enforcement could be. But he made a good point about, or an interesting point about government being a giant gun for sale. It's not exactly for sale. I mean, politics is no doubt contentious. We have different political parties fighting over who's going to make the laws and how the money is going to be spent. But it's not quite the same thing as it's not an actual faction war where we're actually shooting each other, as I
Sometimes
believe
it is.
very rare occasionally, but it's not like a real civil war like I would think, like post Saddam, where Iraq falls apart and all these different groups are vying for power and actually killing each other. It's just the nature of politics. It's more of an argument and then an attempt to get elected and to control those levers of power so that you can decide what happens.
Okay, so thank you, Kyle. I want to actually bring up that point you made as well, Jake. You mentioned it's like a gun. It's neither good. A gun is neither good or evil, right? It depends on what it's done. Sargon of Akkad said, like 1,000, 2,000 years ago, that political violence is the same way. It's not. It's like a gun. It's not good or evil. It depends on who wields it and what they do with it. So, and I don't think the anarchist philosophy would agree with that, because the anarchist philosophy says that violence is always immoral. So I'll let Jake unpack
Well,
that first, and then I want to see what Kyle says in response.
the anarchist philosophy does not find that violence is always immoral. The anarchist philosophy opposes the initiation of violence. It would be pacifism that finds all violence to be immoral. As I like to say, a pacifist, you can walk up, they will not walk up and punch you, and you can walk up and punch them, and they won't punch back. An anarchist or a voluntarist will not walk up and punch you, but if you walk up and punch them, they might punch back. And a statist will walk up and punch you.
Okay, so that ties into the NAP, right?
Yeah, so political violence carried out by a state, that violence is not inherently unjust. I mean, the prosecution of somebody who rapes and murders children, I would say any violence done to that person, by a state or not, is justified. However, the state cannot exist without violence which is fundamentally unlibertarian, such as the forcible confiscation of wealth from everybody to fund itself, or really for inflation control. Taxation is inherently at odds with libertarian principles, with the non-aggression principle, with every individual being free to pursue their own ends and have property rights. If rights enforcement and the like, which I think me and Kyle would agree are necessary, if rights enforcement can conceivably be provided in a way that doesn't violate anybody's rights, that doesn't deprive people of liberty to do as they please and own what they want as long as they're not hurting others, if it can be done that way, then it should. I think Kyle would agree, but where we disagree is he thinks it can't.
Okay, so Kyle, I think the main disagreement here is that it's not that government violence is always immoral, and it doesn't depend on how it's used. It's more of the government is forcing people to be a part of its system, like through taxes. So would you agree that it's not always? I mean, I think you would agree that it's not always immoral. It depends on how the violence is used. So how do you tie that in with taxation?
Libertarians like to talk a lot about the initiation of force, and they say, well, the initiation of force is wrong, and therefore taxation is wrong, and things like that. And the way I justify it is looking at the consequences. And One of those consequences might be that we have public services, we have roads, we have police, we have a structure of laws, we have a justice system. So I look at it as taxes as an obligation of the members of a society to pay, much like dues. You know, I think they're like dues of a club. You're a part of a club or you're part of a country, and therefore you have an obligation to pay those taxes. So once you treat it as, well, you have a legal obligation to pay, they're collecting the money that's rightfully theirs, and so it's not technically an initiation of force, right? It's because if it's lawfully theirs, or if it's not lawfully, I don't want to say that. If it's rightfully their money, and you have an obligation to pay, they're collecting their dues.
Okay, and I just want to real quick point out: is this where your quote, "Your consent is not required," comes from?
I think it was possibly a talk about taxes, but it was probably more just the overarching nature of government. Um, you know, and it is true. I mean, it's a true quote. It makes me sound like a rapist, unfortunately, and that's
Oh,
how the
well,
quote is
I
always
think
taken out of
when I hear it.
No one
the
really
the.
thinks that, Kyle.
Thank you. Yeah, the
It's
quote is
just a
always
joke.
taken out of context, but if you think about the nature of, some people have said, that quote really made me think about politics and the way the world actually works. And it is true. You live in a country that's bigger than you. You live in a society that's bigger than you, and nobody ever really asked you. You're born into it, and you make your way the best you can. But ultimately, you are subject to the whims of the lawmakers and of the police and of the laws of that society in which you live. So you have the option, I guess, of trying to find another country that's more suitable to you. But at this point, nation states cover pretty much the entire earth. So there's few frontiers left of that are not settled. And I'd like to point out, I do think that government happens as a part of the settling process. Like we can look at as the West was settled, at one point it was just wide open land. It was a free for all there. And as more and more people moved in, it became settled, and they established laws. They got sheriffs, they got judges, and they got mayors, and they were off to the races. That was part of the civilization of the wilderness as people moved into that area, which almost makes you think maybe government is kind of a natural or normal process for civilization.
Okay, so Jake, what do you think about your consent? It's not required in terms of taxation, and what do you think about the government being owed the money that you work for because you live in that society?
I will answer that, but real quick, it's funny, Kyle, that you mentioned the Wild West, so to speak. The Wild West is actually used as an example often of where you have had private law, because before government did get established out there, before the federal government imposed its rule and you had local governments and such, before all of that, you did have private rights enforcement agencies, essentially private protection companies that would get you security and justice in the Old West. Now, as far as your consent is not required, as me and Kyle have notoriously uncovered before, taking this logic to its conclusion does just about require admitting or conceding anything any government does to be justified. Now, I know Kyle does not support, he's not a Nazi, he does not support gassing the Jews, thankfully. But we have brought it to the point that he has said, I don't want to misquote, it was like that the Nazi government, it was legitimate, even though it was terrible. It was supported by the German people. It was legitimate, even though it was terrible. Now, I think this point right here demonstrates the problem with this line of reasoning. It makes ethics useless. If your ethical principles revolve around just whatever the state declares is what's just. If they can declare your money is rightfully theirs and that makes it theirs, then you have no reason to have any right and wrong. This is a nihilistic point of view, I think. Now, as far as I consent by living in society, I know you didn't exactly say that, but there's a common contention when I say taxation and stuff. You consent by living in society. That's not how consent works at all.
Yeah, I don't see that, Jake. Before you go into the refuting that point, that's not my point.
I know.
I know you don't consent. I know you don't.
Yes, you say it. It's not required.
That's right.
You're more intellectually honest than the vast majority of minarchists.
Thank you.
But I was kind of just touching on what Isaac said. Isaac said something vaguely related to taxation and consent. You acknowledge that it's not consensual. I would say that because it's not consensual, that means it's not owed, that I have to, my own action must be required for a debt, that I cannot be born owing something, that babies have done nothing wrong or agreed to nothing, and for me to have rights at all means that there can be no positive obligations imposed on me unilaterally, that I have to either agree or harm something. This is pretty central to libertarian philosophy, I think. Now, I'm sorry, what else was I about to answer, Isaac?
So we were talking about the morality of having a taxation that you owe because you live in the society, so you don't have to consent to it, which I think you pretty much talked on pretty well. So, Kyle, what do you think about what Jake said? Because
You know, he does. I know he believes that you know, someone, in order to incur a debt, somebody has to sign on a dotted line or consent to it or something like that.
Verbally.
You know, I've kind of tried to make the point, like, one of my other quotes is, "You're born into a pre-existing society." You know, you're born into a country that already exists, that has a government, that has a tax structure, and it's just an obligation they impose on you as part of being a resident of this land area, that you have to pay their taxes. And you know, I want to clarify, I'm not a supporter of the high income taxes that we have, and I'd prefer no income tax. You know, I'd prefer very, very low taxes, and we would have a lot less objection to taxes if they were much lower. But there are certain things that I see no way around other than a public collection of funds for us to have those things that I see as necessities for this society. You know, we've talked about private, not on this show, but there's the roads question is, you know, how is a road that is shared by an entire community funded without imposing a due? I mean, they'll talk about HOAs, but every HOA imposes dues on its members, you know. And yes, they can move out of the neighborhood, but what happens when the neighborhood is as large as the country? Well, then there's nowhere to move. You know, you have to pay the dues. So we have collective defense, we have collective police, we have collective laws, courts, prisons, and these sorts of things. And there are fees to pay for these things. I just
okay,
don't see any way around it.
thank you, Kyle. Jake, what do you think about what Kyle said? And feel free to touch on the roads position, because the last time we talked about roads on this show, it didn't really go anywhere. So I'd like for that to change.
So the fundamental difference here is ownership. Just because everybody in a town's using a road doesn't mean the town collectively must own the road. I don't think socialism has to apply. I think that if I build a road, I can let a town use it, and that profits me because that's traffic, and traffic is a saleable commodity. So I can sell, you know, I build a road and I sell out space on that road. I subcontract utilities like power and water and stuff that anyone who sets up shop on the road is going to want. And then I lease that out. And the businesses and developers are setting up shop on the road, whether, you know, due to its proximity to whatever it causes traffic. Traffic is a saleable commodity, and that makes, you know, you've got billboards even on government roads. Often they supplement the funding with lots of billboards. You drive on the freeway or something, you'll see them. The fact that you have traffic somewhere, that makes it a saleable commodity, and the fact that it's a saleable commodity means it doesn't have to be socialized. And I would extend this exact same reasoning to anything that is a saleable commodity, such as rights enforcement. Now, if you, Kyle, lived in, say, Sweden or something, you would find two things. If I'm not mistaken, you would find that healthcare is a socialized service. I believe Sweden has a nationalized healthcare industry. And you would find that a shit ton of roads are actually private there, like 40% or so are private. And some of those get government subsidies. A huge portion of them have not, and are funded by voluntary dues and such. Now, you mentioned an HOA imposing dues. The difference there is that that's consensual. I recognize that if I own a house and you own a house, or I should say this differently. If I build 3 houses, you live in one, Isaac lives in one, I live in the other one, I can say, hey, if you guys want to move into these houses I built that are mine, you have to agree to membership in this HOA and follow these rules. And they are actually my property, so I have the right to do that. Governments, on the other hand, this does not apply to. the country is not, I consider countries to be a nonsensical concept. They arbitrarily declare millions of square miles to be their jurisdiction, essentially their property, which they can make you pay them to live on, which it's not like they developed all of America. They've built stuff in America by taking money from us. The vast majority of America is still barren. I shouldn't say barren, but it's still, natural virgin land, which I would say nobody has a claim to. Libertarian ethics generally hold the homestead principle that man must transform things from nature and appropriate them to himself for survival, which is an axiomatic interest, can't be denied in oneself by any party to any dispute without a performative contradiction in the process. This logically lands you at property rights based on the homestead principle, Lockean property ethic.
Okay, so Kyle, feel free to respond, and then I have 2 more questions for you guys, and then we'll say our closing. So go ahead,
Perfect.
Kyle. Thanks, Jake.
I'm totally down to keep going. I feel like this has not been long enough.
Jake kind of went off on some tangents there about socialized healthcare and things like that. We were talking about roads. When you take the example he used was
I'm sorry to interrupt. Let me be crystal clear. I am in no way endorsing socialized healthcare. I am not at all supporting socialized healthcare. I'm saying somebody in a socialized healthcare society, it might be inconceivable to them that you can get healthcare without it being collectivized, that it can only be an everybody chips in kind of model. And as we can plainly see in places that have robust private sectors in healthcare, despite the fact that it's a cronyistic mess that's artificially expensive and all that, it still is demonstrated to be a saleable commodity.
Yes, Jake is not supporting socialism.
No.
Gotcha.
I'm the one here not supporting socialism.
Go ahead, Kyle.
And in his example of a private road, he really didn't run into any of the issues that there are with private roads, which is, you have developments around these roads, businesses around main streets or houses around a neighborhood road that are already established. They already have access to that road. That road is not private. That road is shared by all of them, and they're not going to be interested in someone taking ownership of it in order to charge them tolls or something like that. So,
pre-existing things do. You're absolutely right. Things do get all messy ethically when you have things that already have been built. I'm kind of talking from scratch, but things that have already been built, and we were all, in my view, robbed to pay for. Therefore, all arguably have some claim to. There's a few ways that can go. It gets a little hairy.
It would be nice to see some experiments done on this front, but okay. So I feel like
one more thing on it. I do want to say, the big issue that I try to bring up is the landlocking problem with private roads. There's this presumption that everybody's just going to say, oh, you can use my road and I'll make a profit and tax you. But, there would be an opportunity to impose exorbitant tolls on people just to move anywhere. If you want to leave your house, you have to pay whatever I ask. Or if I don't like you, you lose your access altogether. So you would have a lot of conflicts with people saying, this is my road and no one's allowed to use it, or I'm not even going to keep this as a road. You've been relying on this to get to work, but I'm shutting it down and turning it into a golf course. You know what I mean? So you have lots of problems like that where you have limited space, no other options, and no other way to go. And it really would box people in and also create travel restrictions where you'd have to get permission from numerous property owners just to cross from A to B anywhere in the country.
Okay, I'm not totally sure that golf courses are such a bad thing, but no, I'm just kidding. So, all right, real quick, I want to ask you guys 2 more questions. Jake, feel free to say something if it's you've got it going.
I wanted to respond to what Kyle just said.
Go ahead.
So, in libertarian ethics, I cannot fly a helicopter. Say you're walking through the desert, I fly over you with a helicopter, and I've got a big cargo container, and I drop it around you, imprisoning you. All right, I've not physically touched you, but I've imprisoned you. You're kind of implying that this is completely NAP compliant when you say that road owners can just box you in so you can't go anywhere. No, there's a such thing called a right of way. And I think it's a fair assumption that a free market and protection would recognize that you can't imprison people who haven't done anything and have that be enforced. Now, practically speaking, enforcing a restriction on who enters the road to the point that people can't leave their houses or something, this steers away profit. You're not going to make anything as a road. Now, if you're some crazy billionaire, there's a common objection to anarcho-capitalism is you could say the crazy billionaire, because there's a lot of things you could come up with that a crazy billionaire might be able to do. I think he's got even more destructive power with a state present. You know, a crazy billionaire in an anarcho-capitalist society might like make it so someone has to build a new road, right, in order for a more direct route to a certain place to be present, because someone who owned a road, now it's not a road. You can't do that if people live on the road and stuff and need it. There would be pre-existing contracts for that.
Okay.
But
the arbitration network might be able to handle it, right? Is what you're saying in terms of the road.
We might have lost Jake.
Yeah, it's okay. I'll bring him back.
Can you hear me?
In 3 seconds. You back, Jake?
Yeah, I'm back. Can you hear me?
Kyle?
I can hear you guys. Yes.
Good. Okay. So I forgot whose turn it was, but if you guys want to keep talking about the roads, that's fine. But we still have 2 more questions to get to.
Let's get to those last 2 questions.
All right.
Okay, let's do it. I think we hit the roads pretty well. So one is geared that supports your argument, Kyle, and one is geared that supports your argument, Jake. So this is going to be fun. They're good ones. So let's start with the one that supports Kyle's position, and we'll end on the one that supports Jake's. So this is a regulation question. In terms of regulations, there was an example back in, I think, the 1940s where Ford, I think, was producing a car, and there was a part on the car that cost $40 extra per car to make, and it would save 2,000 lives, right? So they ran the calculations, and they decided that this part on the car wasn't worth adding because it would only cost 2,000 lives. It would be too expensive. They didn't add it. 2,000 people died. They only added it after a government regulation forced them to. So, Kyle, do you think that this is where examples of government regulation shine in terms of necessity? And Jake, do you think that regulations are retroactive and the free market could have retroactively solved the problem in the same way? So let's start with Kyle there, and then we'll go on to Jake.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would say I do think it's a good example. There is a liability there, or a more than a liability, but possibly criminal negligence for putting out a product that actually killed people. So even by prosecuting, the government, without passing a regulation, could impel producers to start taking those safety precautions because they're afraid that somebody's going to die, and then they're going to be charged with negligent homicide or contributory homicide or something. So, but I do in general think that there's a role for regulation of the market, much like, I love the sports analogies. I love sports. I love the NFL. There's numerous rules and regulations and penalties and things like that. The game has rules, and I apply that same logic to capitalism. It is not a complete free for all out there. There are definitely restrictions on what you're allowed to do within the context of the law and within the context of the market. And you can't go outside of that. You can't employ child slaves, for example. You can't pump smog out of a smokestack into the upper atmosphere. There are numerous places where we can say a behavior that somebody was engaging in that was harmful to others was curtailed by a new regulation. I just think that cat gets out of the box, and they go nuts with the regulations, and pretty soon, your handicap ramp is 2 inches too low or something like that, and now you're facing penalties and fines and things like that. The regulators have a tendency to go way overboard anything that could be considered reasonable. But yeah, in general, there are examples where I do think the market needs regulation. Let me just conclude with that.
Okay, Jake, and what do you think about how the free market could potentially solve the problems that regulations aim to fix?
I definitely agree that the market does need regulation. I contend that this doesn't require a state. As I agree with what Kyle said about liability applying. I think if you sell a car that the person's going to die from, and you don't at least divulge that part's not working or something, and they die, you can be held legally liable for that. And this can be true with or without a state. A government legal system as well as a private legal system can both solve that. retroactively. As far as non-retroactively, however, we already have private oversight. I was in the kosher food industry for several years, and religious Jews will only buy food if it's kosher. And the way they know it's kosher is they go to the store and they look at the food they want to buy, and it's got a thing called a hechsher. And what a hechsher is, it's a little stamp from a private regulatory body that can be like the Orthodox Union or Star K, Chalaf Yisrael. There's a lot of competing organizations because kosher food is not a function of the FDA or any government agency. There's no government agency that says this food's kosher. So there are private agencies that kosher food producers hire in order to certify their food as kosher. That system works pretty well. I watched it for years in front of me. Now, it's funny you mentioned like the smokestack. Governments over 100 years ago created these artificial legal shields. Like in America, the Supreme Court did this. These artificial legal shields shielding polluters from tort liability. In the absence of a monopoly on force, you couldn't create such an arbitrary artificial legal shield because there's no monopoly to say these people are immune for whatever they do. You could actually hold them accountable. So I think you'd have better ability to hold people accountable for their torts. They wouldn't be able to simply buy out regulators in order to be able to do what they want, even if it's harmful, and keep competitors from doing things that aren't even harmful, right? Currently, you've got the FDA, which asserts a monopoly on oversight on making sure that food is safe, as in it won't kill you. It won't have salmonella or E. coli or anything. I think it's fairly safe assumption that people in general would rather know their food doesn't have salmonella or E. coli. So there would be, without the FDA, there would be private equivalents of the kosher food, but with general safety. And currently, the FDA, because it's imposed as an umbrella monopoly of standards that must be forcibly applied to everyone, they have to make allowances for things that private agencies don't necessarily have to. Like there's a certain acceptable degree, legal degree of carcinogens and rat feces that can be in your food right now. They have to allow that because it's this blanket umbrella monopoly. But if you had a free market system and you could have competing standards and such, they could say no rat feces in the food. I could go to the store and know that there won't be feces in my food. Now, the FDA, by the way, has admitted to killing hundreds of thousands of people. This is kind of a seen versus unseen thing. Because when the FDA approves a drug, every life that drug saves afterwards can be considered a life saved in part by the FDA by approving it. But the unseen is they did this with like beta blockers, right? They kept beta blockers for people with heart issues off the market for like 10 years. It took them 10 or so years to approve it. And then they finally did approve it. It saved a certain number of thousand people every year afterwards. But by admitting that, the FDA was kind of implicitly admitting that by keeping it off the market for those 10 years, they killed hundreds of thousands of people. So,
okay, so regulations can be handled by the free market onto the market potentially more efficiently than government is pretty much the sum of your point, right?
Yes, and even a democratic government favors concentrated interests. What I mean by that is the public good problem applies. People, you could say the naive model of democracy, also as Friedman likes to put it, is that whatever the majority wants and whatever serves the interests of the majority is what will be legislated. But in practice, it's a lot easier to congeal resources and wealth and power to like make a law happen if you have a concentrated interest, if you have a small group. For example, you're more likely to find farming subsidies that tax from city folk and give it to farm folk. You're a lot more likely to find that in a country with a small minority of farmers. And the same thing applies to regulations. So when you've got an oligarchy like Big Pharma and such, that's who writes the regulations. And that's part of how they have an oligarchy.
Right. Okay. So Kyle, feel free to respond, and then try to make it quick so Jake doesn't have to reply. And
Sorry that I ramble so much.
No, you're fine. You're good.
Yeah, I do think with the anarchist position, they lack that coercive backstop that regulations give you, where it's like you've broken the regulation and now here come the consequences, ultimately leading up to fines you have to pay, arrest, incarceration, that sort of thing. So, For me, once I changed philosophies from anarchy to minarchy into statism, it was almost like having a hammer in my tool belt again. It was like, oh, now we can say this is how it's going to be, whether you like it or not. And I really felt handcuffed as an anarchist because it was like, how is this enforcement going to work exactly? How is this market regulation going to work, without that hammer, without that definitive, you have broken the rules and now here come the consequences. So that was a real problem for me on the anarchist side. He does make some good points about the failings of the FDA. I'm not really going to sit here and defend the FDA. I think it's difficult to strike that balance between, you know, having regulation, having food that's safe to eat, and not going overboard with it. And you'll find in politics that's a common problem where it's like, okay, we like this a little bit, but then it goes completely overboard, and now we can't drink raw milk, and we have all this mandatory labeling, and we have all this stuff where we really think we've gone overboard. So overregulation is a big problem. But I just think that I don't trust that the market would regulate itself. That doesn't make any sense to me. Again, you're going to have these different interests that are going to do what they want to do, and they are going to do what they want to do, as long as they have the wealth and resources to do it, and you lack the wealth and resources to stop them. They're going to do what they want to do, and you no longer would have the recourse to call the police.
Okay, I just want to point out that handcuffed as an anarchist is a very ironic term.
Yeah.
Anarchists are free, right? So that's a quote of the day today. So okay, I want to end with something that supports Jake's position. And,
Wait, can I real quick just address what
yes,
Kyle said?
Yes, you can.
I'm so glad you said it really well like this, that you felt like you don't have the hammer in your tool belt. And I as I was mentioning earlier, I think this is our most fundamental disagreement, is that you don't see it as feasible that you'll be able to ultimately wield superior firepower against aggressors. And my contention is that you're more likely to be able to wield superior firepower against aggressors, with those aggressors being private and with you being in a paradigm of free contract and such, than in the statist society. I would say that if you, for example, are selling a car as being certified safe, and that car is actually not certified safe, or it's actually not safe or whatever, and in some way you've committed fraud amounting to negligent homicide or something, I can prosecute you. I can go to my rights enforcement agency, of which there already are many, and I don't think they're going anywhere. Currently, they can use the state as backup, but they could ultimately use each other as backup, and I think they most certainly would. Not out of altruism, not out of goodness, not out of people being perfect, but out of rational self-interest to profit, to be viable as a company that continues to exist. They must cohesivize in order to protect themselves, to be sustainable as operations. So therefore, you absolutely can. You do have the power of a contract network if you are a legitimate company that actually abides by your contracts, that actually abides, but that goes along with contract enforcement. Whereas if you are a rogue company, you're not going to have that. Therefore, you have the inferior firepower. So I say that anarcho-capitalism is a unique, very unique system in that it is the only one that actually can conceivably render it such that right makes might. Notice I'm saying right makes might, not might makes right.
I think he's wrong. I think the bad guys would win.
Okay. All right. Thank you both. Last question. Startup societies. Now, this is something that I like to think of a lot. What do you guys both think about this? What if we had little test examples? So in science, we have a hypothesis and we experiment with it because that's the only way you're going to find out if something actually works. So what if we had little startup societies where people voluntarily gathered in small communities and they tested their philosophies that they agreed to consensually? So a little ANCAP society over here, a little ANCOM society over here, a voluntarist society over here. Whichever one works the most efficiently, we start to upscale, see how it works on the upscale, then try to make that the new paradigm of maybe self-government or government, whichever one works the best. So what do you think about startup societies, Jake, or the Seastead thing?
I'm all for it, of course.
Yeah,
by the way, Kyle also mentioned that in an anarchist society, I'm not going to have any ability to stop people from forming governments, to stop people from engaging in relationships that are like government. be it democratic or even monarchies or even things that look like feudalism, kind of whatever. And to an extent, this is true. What I do contend that I can stop people from doing in an anarcho-capitalist paradigm of private rights enforcement and arbitration is I can summon force to protect my rights. So if people want to form a government and tax me, there are methods I can use to inhibit them from being able to do that. I also think that in order to have anarchy with a non-anarchist majority, you have to make it impossible to govern in some way. I think if everyone's using cryptocurrency, for example, and technologies emerge to make it easier to facilitate business and do your everyday life in cryptocurrency, and the state simply couldn't actually enforce taxes effectively enough to maintain their monopoly on force, I think that could happen. And in that scenario, no matter how many people are statists, there won't be a state. But
love the Bitcoin.
Short of something like that, ultimately, I cannot, in an anarchist society, stop people from voluntarily forming a community with something resembling a government. But what I can stop them from doing using force that will overwhelm theirs is from forcing it onto me.
Okay, thank you, Jake. And Kyle, what do you think about this idea of testing different political philosophies?
Yeah, just to respond to Jake's point, I mean, it's a recipe for conflict and chaos because he's always going to be in conflict with people trying to impose taxes on him, trying to control his behavior with laws. He's always going to be picking up the phone to call his rights enforcement agency, and they're always going to be fighting with the will of the people or the people trying to be the government or whoever. It's just that's why anarchy is chaos, because everybody can't have their own way, right? We're going to end up fighting everybody's going to end up fighting each other. But as far as startup societies, the problem is there's nowhere to start them up, right? Everywhere that exists right now is covered under state government, state laws. It's very hard to find anywhere in the world that is sort of open frontier and free to experiment. They've tried in like New Hampshire to sort of make it little libertarian, but even that hasn't really worked. So the notion of experimenting, what we should do is actually change the existing society to be the way that we want it to be. If we want taxes to be lowered, we need to run for office, we need to get elected, and then we need to vote for lower taxes. Having the support of a significant percentage of the population behind us. That's really the only way we're going to be able to experiment, is by taking control of high tax people, taking control of government from people who believe in high taxes, progressivism, welfare state, warfare state, and actually transforming the existing society into something that we would prefer. A low tax society. We could liberalize drug laws. We could free businesses up. We could reduce regulations, make it easier to do business. I mean, we could really, really turn this into a good society. And I think that's a better option than trying to carve out your own little micro neighborhood of something, or trying to get a bunch of ANCAPs together. Because even also, I want to point out, with a small society, you lose the division of labor unless you really keep trade open. We rely on global trade. Half the stuff we buy isn't even made in America. It's made overseas. So, there's a lot of trade going on with other countries and other people, and food sources and stuff like that. It's just very, very difficult to make a small community that would enjoy the standard of living of a larger community, or a larger society like we live in, where we currently enjoy the benefits of free trade, or mostly free trade.
Thank
I
you,
want to
Kyle.
say I agree with almost everything Kyle just said.
Yeah,
Absolutely. The division of labor. How did Mises put it? You probably know this. That it is the great means of society, or that society is the great means by which man may achieve his ends. Something like that. And that's absolutely true. For a small, I should ask you this, Kyle. I think Isaac might have been looking for an answer to something like this. Suppose that me and Isaac and my ANCAP friends that are watching this and all that, suppose that we went and a bunch of us pooled money together and found a bunch of unoccupied land right in the desert of, say, Utah or Arizona or something way out there. And say we want to set up an ANCAP community where we want to be exempt from all taxes and all drug laws and stuff, that we only want the non-aggression principle, that we're not going to go fight anybody, we're not going to go hurt anyone, We just want to be free to do our own thing, not impose anything onto others. Would you support us at least having the liberty to try? Or would you support when agents of the state come with guns to take us all away or shoot us if we resist?
That's a good question because, I mean, the land that you're talking about claiming for yourselves is currently claimed by government. You know, it's public land. Say it's just open desert, but you know, it's still property of the state of Nevada or property of state of Arizona, and they're going to treat you like a cult or something like that, and they're not going to let you have an exemption from the laws of that state. So
I guess
just
my question was,
That's
would you
nice
like
to
them to? If you're the guy in charge, you can press the button and say these ANCAPs are free to go be ANCAPs, and they can opt. What I should say is, should I be able to opt out of government? Like, not what would happen, but if you were the king of the world and you could make it happen, would you give people the freedom to, as long as they're not going encroaching on others, to opt out of government systems and either form their own, as long as there's no,
Here's a good way of putting it, Kyle. Let's say we start a religion based around ayahuasca, right? The drink of the gods, and we want to be exempt from taxes and live in our own private community, like the Amish, right? So we're not necessarily starting our own completely isolated separate community. We're not trying to wage war against the state. We're just going to be on our own, like a community that already exists, maybe like the Native Americans, and we maybe ask for permission to do so. It's not very anarchist, but, you know, just for the sake of conjecture. What do you think about that kind of thing?
Yeah, I'm trying to put myself in the position of someone who would have deciding power over that piece of land. And that's probably not the federal government, although it's possible it could be. I guess if it's federal lands, I was thinking more of like a state governor or something like that. Somebody who actually has the opportunity to allow this breakaway sect. Um, I want to say yes, but at the same time, I just don't see you guys being completely isolated, right? You're still going to be trading with the population. You're still going to be interacting with the population. Goods and services are going to be coming in and out. Are you going to be
is that a problem?
completely? Well, it is, because you want to be exempt from the laws of this country, yet you want to interact with this country and conduct trade with this country. So,
Like
you
other
know,
countries do.
there's gonna
This is
be
already the case. This is
there's
already
going to be
true.
contract disputes. There's going to be issues that our courts have to resolve, and we have to figure out how to deal with you. And
Well,
so that's what I see being the problem. I just don't see as far as me personally, it's really hard to say, not being in that position. And I do believe in such low taxes that, you know, would it make much of a difference? Not really. I mean, but you're talking about a secessionist state, right? A secessionist country
Yes.
or a secessionist piece of land where you have your own borders, and you get to live the way you want within that jurisdiction. And Mises did address that, as far as, you know, he was pro secession. He was like, hey, if the majority in this area wants to break off, you should let them. Um, you know, the only thing we'd be giving up as a nation would be that land and any resources. You know, say there was oil under there or something like that. That could cause some
agree with that.
conflict. But, you know, as if it was unused desert, I think I'd be okay with you know, having that, you know, much like I'd be okay with the Indian reservations being essentially self-governing.
Okay, well, I think that's a great spot to wrap it up because we have a potential compromise here. So, real quick, thanks again to our sponsors at Antrap Designs. You can get very high quality anarchist shirts like the one in the background, and they're very comfortable. Jake would know, right, Jake?
Yeah, I have one. I should have worn it.
Yeah, well,
It's
he likes
great.
this.
Looks great. Comfortable. They're
Yeah.
awesome. And now
So-
available in black, which, if you're like me and have spent 10 years eating as much pasta as you possibly could, they're in black. There's big ones.
Cool. And you can find more interesting content at The Lucid Truth. Where can we find both of your content, guys? You're on Facebook, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I have a group called Anarcho-Capitalism versus Minarchism debate group, where we've been debating these topics for many years, just to death. And then, you know, you can like the Facebook page, Misesians. I don't post there very often, but it is a good page with some good content on it. I also have a page called Being Liberal, It's not the big being liberal. It was a spoof of the big being liberal, but you know, the philosophy of limited government, free markets, and private property was formerly known as liberalism, and I think it was a mistake to ever embrace the word libertarian. We should have stuck to liberal. You know, and
Wouldn't that be
liberal
confusing
today
though?
is not what it typically meant. The word liberal derives from liberty. So, yeah, you can check out that page as well.
Okay, and Jake, where can we find your stuff? You run a few groups, right?
Yeah, that's not usually where I'm found. I run a group called A Group Where We Pretend to Be Statists.
Such a funny group.
Kyle, I don't know if you're in it. You're welcome to come to it.
I am in the group. I am in the group. It's a weird place for me to be because I am a statist.
Yeah,
But
but here's the thing. Here's the thing. You're way less like the way we
would
pretend
never
in there.
know.
We're way. Everybody's breaking
extreme.
authoritarian in there.
Yeah.
You could still have fun in there, I think.
Basically,
Mhm.
pretend to be fascist.
You know, just
Where
like
else?
I could pretend to be an alt, some weird form of ANCAP, like an alt cap, or
Right.
even just like you ever see the video? It's like you know, the trash man, the garbage man comes
Yeah.
and
Where else can we
brazenly
find
violates it.
You've got your
I could cartoonize an ANCAP. I am a cartoon of an ANCAP in some ways.
Yeah.
I am.
Yeah. Is that the only place we can find you?
Oh, I mean, I don't know, just post stuff to Facebook, and I used to write stuff on Steam it, but I'll probably get back into that soon. Maybe.
All right, there's your names for everyone to see.
Couple of YouTube
There we
videos.
go. You guys might get some friend requests from this video. So thanks again for participating, guys. We are looking for people to come into the next video. I've got a few anarchists lined up. So I'm actually looking for people more on Kyle's side, more minarchist, statist side. That would be great because we've got a few anarchist volunteers who seem really ready. So maybe you could post something in your group. I'll ask for some volunteers. We try to have a fair show here. So that would be awesome. Were you gonna say, Jake?
One thing I want to propose. There's one point that Kyle made that if we could come to a point of agreement on this one point, then either we'd both be minarchists or we'd both be ANCAPs. And he said the bad guys would win. I would be down to do a whole nother debate just on that point. The bad guys would win.
Well, if you guys want to do another debate, I'm open to hosting it after we have a few more episodes. So if you guys are down for it, we'll do. I want to have Daniel Blois on. He's like an anarchist scholar. I'm looking for a good contestant for him. So we'll have a few more episodes, and then we'll maybe host you guys again. That would be fun. But thank you both for participating. Anyone in the audience, please follow both of these people for future discussion. And thanks everyone for tuning in. That was fun.
Hey,
Thank you,
thanks for
Isaac.
making this happen. I've been wanting to do this for years. Thank you.
Yeah,
Kyle, thank you.
it was very fun.